So welcome to episode 41 of 10 Minute Record Reviews, and this time we're going to talk about Archie Shepp's 1972 album Attica Blues. And what I have here is the first pressing of that album, which I have to say sounds pretty darn good. So this is Archie Shepp's 70s phase. It's very distinct. If you're familiar with his work in the 60s, his avant-garde stuff like The Magic of Juju and so on, this is very different. It's a large ensemble. There are strings, there are voices, there's some really funky tracks on here. It's a totally eclectic mix. It's what you might call, I guess, psychedelic soul jazz or something like that. His playing on sax is a kind of a blend of he manages to blend these, his avant-garde work with more almost like cool jazz styles. He manages to be challenging and listenable at the same time, which is not something that everybody in the avant-garde managed. Not this is a super avant-garde record, but he brings that ability to synthesize those different strands forward into the 1970s in a real sweet spot, better than other folks ever managed to do that kind of synthesis. Certainly better than Coltrane ever managed it. My only sort of beef about this album is because there are so many players on it. It can't help but sound a little bit muddy at times. I'm somebody who loves to pick out the individual contributions of musicians. That's one of the great things I think about jazz, and particularly post-war jazz, is the ability to do that. This ends up at times sounding a little bit muddy, and that I say that I have my own bias against sort of larger groups, larger bands, and so I have to kind of weigh that there. But I do find this sounds a little bit muddy. It doesn't sound as clear as some of the other stuff he did, for the same label. Some background on the Attica prison uprising in 1971, which of course is the impetus for this. And Shepp, of course, is a highly socially conscious and highly politically motivated musician who wasn't going to take any shit, frankly, and nor should he in particularly as regards the subject matter of this album. So the Attica, of course, the prison upstate New York. The prisoners, the prison had been swelling in population in the early 70s, in large measure because of a lot of crackdowns on the Black Power movement and arrests that were happening in New York, and so the population had almost doubled, largely with African American inmates, and protests for better living conditions and against sort of oppressive treatment ended up going sideways. There's a riot. More than half of the inmates rioted and took control of the prison. Over 40 staff were taken hostage. There were several days of negotiations, but they couldn't come to an agreement, particularly because the prisoners wanted amnesty for charges against, related to the riot, and the government, the state wouldn't guarantee that. Nelson Rockefeller, who's the governor at the time, orders in the state police, who brought with them former prison guards from Attica, which is widely condemned. It's just a bad idea. They use enormous violence in retaking the prison. They basically pump smoke in the place. They use shotguns. There are 43 people killed, including 10 employees of the prison. Only 5 of those 10 employees of the prison were killed by the inmates. The other 5 were actually killed by friendly fire. There were 33 inmates that were killed. It was just an absolute bloodbath. And the uprising then and historically has become this major moment in civil rights, and certainly the history of sort of great, sort of obvious repressive actions by American states. So Shepp is clearly motivated by, when he's making this record, by the recent context, and of course by lots of other things that have been happening, the crackdown on the Black Panthers and the Angela Davis trial and various other things. So side one kicks off with Attica Blues. This is a guy called Beaver Harris wrote the lyrics, and the singer is a guy called Henry Hull, who has quite a feminine voice, a very beautiful voice, and sings like his life depends on it through this particular track. The lyrics are absolutely beautiful. They're not lengthy. They repeat. If I had the chance to make decisions, every man would walk the earth in equal conditions. and similar kinds of emotions being expressed. The energy in this track is amazing. Which is remarkable because there's a large number of musicians, and I frankly would imagine it's harder to pull off that degree of passion when you've got a big room full of people as opposed to 4 or 5. But they were all feeling it, and it's really quite something. It's just full tilt. I mean, it's a beautiful song, and yet you can feel this full tilt anger all the way through the song. Followed by a little bit of spoken word by William Kunstler, who is quite a famous lawyer, white guy, but a lawyer who acted for a lot of people accused during the civil rights era, and was part of the negotiating team negotiating on behalf of the prisoners during the Attica riots. And so we hear a little bit from him. He's basically reciting poetry at different points in the album. Then we're on to a song called "Steam," which is a different kind of a theme from. If it is a civil rights tune, it's very very broadly defined. Let's put it that way. It's a beautiful song. It's got this wonderful sort of atmospheric production. It has this sort of swirling strings and alto sax. And some rather sort of Beatlesy kind of instrumentation. Very likable tune. Followed by Invocation to Mr. Parker, which I think is about Charlie Parker, and I'm not having researched it. I'm just assuming that's the case. And there's some lovely flute by Marion Brown in this track, and then Steam is reprised with just the previous song, and we have part 2 of Steam. Once again, those swirly strings, and I guess it's actually a soprano sax. I now think about it, not an alto. And then you have Joe Wilson providing these really kind of almost croony, but very life-affirming, very positive vocals. And funnily enough, for me, that song totally evokes Steam. I can't explain why, but it seems to. Side 2 begins with Blues for Brother Jackson, which is, I think, one of the best examples of Shepp's big ensemble pieces. I don't think always worked. This one does. Again, it's not big band, even though it is a big band. I think it's more important to call it an ensemble piece because it doesn't sound like a big band at all, not in the jazz sense. There are 12 horn players, brass and reed, on this track alone. Interestingly, Shepp brings this whole album together, but you don't hear him play that much, or certainly solo. His solos are brief. They're almost all in and out within sort of 20 seconds. This is about the clearest and most extended example of Shepp soloing in the whole album. The BBC, in writing about this album, talks about these fruity tenor blasts, which actually I thought was quite a good description. These are pretty fruity tenor blasts. Then another invocation by Kunstler, who's reciting this time a poem by William G. Harris. And then in his sort of inimitable kind of New York accent. Then a Ballad for a Child, which is basically a riff on the poem which Kunstler has just recited. Henry Hull singing again, total passion again. It's such a great decision to bring him in on this record by Shepp. And then you've got strings and piano underneath Archie's tenor for an extended period, and I think this may be the most beautiful song on the album. Then Goodbye Sweet Pops, which is a tribute to Louis Armstrong, who had just died the previous year. I think it's just okay. And I mean, it's not a bad song, but not super memorable. And then, oddly, the album closes out with Quiet Dawn. I don't know what I think about this song. I don't even know if it's possible to know what one thinks about this song, because the decision was made. Song written by Cal Massey, one of the musicians collaborating with Shepp on this. But the decision was made to have Cal Massey's 7-year-old daughter sing this song, and with the greatest of respect to her, Wahida Massey, she does a creditable job for a 7-year-old, but it's still a 7-year-old singing a song, and it doesn't really work, I don't think, and that seems to be the consensus amongst other people who have reviewed this album. It actually seems like a good song underneath that. It would be great to hear it sung not by a 7-year-old. So there you go. It also has 26 different players, which somewhat complicates matters as well. So, what do I say about Attica Blues? I give it 4 out of 5 stars. There's some really great high points on here, really great, and moments of real power. Let down by a few things. Let down by the murkiness just by the sheer number of players. The strange choice on the last song to have it sung by my child. I also as a real Archie Shepp fan, it's kind of frustrating not to have more Archie on the on this album. So all that said, it's it's a one-off, and it really is a must listen for anybody who's a fan of Archie Shepp, whether of his avant-garde stuff in the '60s or of his more exploratory stuff in the 1970s.